In 1970, the state of Massachusetts planned a massive celebration of the 350th anniversary of the Plymouth Colony. The organizers of the event wanted to show a spirit of cooperation, so they invited Wampanoag leader Frank Wamsutta James to deliver a speech at a state dinner. But there was a catch. They asked to see his speech first, and when they read it, they refused to let him deliver it. They offered to write him a new speech, one that was more positive, but Frank refused. Why? Because Frank wasn't going to repeat the schoolbook lie. He was going to tell the truth. And here are a few lines from that suppressed speech. Listen closely. It is with mixed emotions that I stand here to share my thoughts. This is a time of celebration for you. Celebrating an anniversary of a beginning for the white man in America. A time for looking back, of reflection. It is with a heavy heart that I look back upon what happened to my people. Even before the Pilgrims landed, it was common practice for explorers to capture Indians, take them back to Europe, and sell them as slaves. The Pilgrims had hardly explored the shores of Cape Cod for only 4 days before they had robbed the graves of my ancestors and stolen their corn and beans. We, the Wampanoag, welcomed you, the white man, with open arms, little knowing that it was the beginning of the end, that before 50 years were to pass, the Wampanoag would no longer be a free people. The story of the first Thanksgiving isn't just historical misunderstanding. It's a carefully protected national myth designed to make us feel better about the origins of the United States. Well, today we're going to deconstruct this history and separate fact from fiction. Let's decolonize Thanksgiving together. Hey everyone, this is Dr. B. Welcome back to my Indigenous Studies Masterclass, where we explore Indigenous America, past, present, and beyond. Just a real quick warning, this lesson discusses genocide and indigenous dispossession, so please take care as we move forward. All right, let's jump in. First, let's clear the table about some basic facts that most people get wrong about the first Thanksgiving in the Plymouth Colony. Let's talk about the rock that wasn't there. So we're told that they landed at Plymouth Rock. In reality, the Mayflower's first landfall was Cape Cod. And as far as the colonists stepping onto the special rock, that story may well be made up. Now there is a tourist attraction called Plymouth Rock, and you can go visit it, but it's not a historical fact. And let me let you in on a little secret. It's kind of a letdown of a tourist attraction. Go see for yourself. And why do we call them pilgrims? Because they didn't call themselves that. They were English religious separatists. So that heroic pilgrim identity was a branding exercise created much later to give America a spiritual national origin story. And that famous Thanksgiving Day menu, it's mostly fiction. Now there was a feast, but they didn't call it Thanksgiving, and the so-called pilgrims didn't even invite the Wampanoag. The English fired their muskets and the Wampanoag heard, and they came over to investigate. And only then did they sit down and share a meal. And it wasn't turkey, pumpkin pie, and cranberry sauce. And the pilgrims didn't have enough food to feed the Wampanoag, so the Wampanoag had to go out and hunt for some deer. We will never know what was on the menu. It was probably mostly fowl, corn, and venison. We almost have no primary source details about what exactly happened at this 1621 meal. But those are just details. Let's look at the deeper lie. The settling of the Plymouth Colony relies mostly on the pristine wilderness myth, or the idea of terra nullius, nobody's land, free for the taking. And that narrative is completely false. The Wampanoag were only one of dozens of sovereign indigenous nations that lived in and around the area. This was not unsettled territory. There were literally tens of thousands of indigenous people living along the Atlantic coast. And these colonists called it the New World because it was only new to them. Indigenous nations had been there since the beginning of time. And to Europeans, this was a wilderness because they had no understanding of indigenous land management practices. William Bradford, Plymouth's longtime governor, describes New England as a hideous, desolate wilderness full of wild beasts and wild men. But that was a complete lie because they were walking into a world that was teeming with life and biodiversity. So what made it possible for these newcomers to settle at Plymouth? European diseases. From 1616 to 1619, a massive epidemic, probably smallpox, swept through the area. It destroyed large numbers of indigenous towns, including the town of Pawtuxet. And this was the place where the English would settle. And this part of the story matters because without the introduction of European diseases, English settlement may not have been possible. And these epidemics and slave raids had been devastating the area for decades. So before that famous mill in 1621, the dynamic wasn't friendship. There were kidnappings, there were enslavement, and there was theft. Take the story of Tisquantum, also known as Squanto, as an example. Now, we're all taught that he's the friendly Indian who just appears to help the Indians plant corn and learn how to fish. But the truth is far more sinister. In reality, in 1614, he was kidnapped by an Englishman named Thomas Hunt and sold into slavery in Spain. He was one of thousands of indigenous people who were kidnapped and sold into slavery. Tisquantum would spend years fighting to find his way home, and when he made it, he found his hometown of Pawtuxet completely wiped out by European diseases. And as for the innocent pilgrims, there is primary source evidence that just days after they landed, they looted Native American graves and food stores. These people were so desperate and starving that they stole from Native American graves just to survive. I know much of this is probably really disturbing, but they detail their behavior in their own journals. And it showed the lack of respect that these so-called pious people had for indigenous communities. So why would the leader of the Wampanoag Confederacy, Massasoit, make a peace deal with these newcomers? Massasoit was navigating a geopolitical crisis. His people had been devastated by European diseases, and he had rival indigenous nations who were threatening his borders. He needed allies, and the English had guns. So he struck a deal. Keep in mind, there were only 102 colonists who stepped off the Mayflower, and half of those people died in the first year. From the perspective of Massasoit and the Wampanoag, they were not a military threat. At least not at this time, but in the coming decades, everything would change. Now, Massasoit did his best to guide his people through this uncertain future, but it was only a matter of time before the English completely destroyed Wampanoag sovereignty and freedom. And this is what the myth of Thanksgiving completely hides. In the beginning, there was a peace agreement, but the English came here to colonize. But colonial expansion demands indigenous land and resources and punishes any type of resistance. And if you want to know about what some call the real history of Thanksgiving proclamations, you have to look at 1637. Colonial forces would attack a Pequot town at Mystic River. They set the town on fire and they killed anyone who was trying to escape. Hundreds of Pequot, mostly women, children, and elders were gone in less than an hour. This is known as the Mystic River Massacre. And here's the part Americans rarely hear. After the massacre, the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop, declared a day of thanks. So yes, there was a Thanksgiving. It was a celebration of the destruction of the Pequot and other indigenous peoples. I know this is not the Thanksgiving story that you were sold when you were in elementary school, and the story only gets worse. What about the Wampanoag? Well, for the next 40 years, Massasoit did his best to maintain peace. He would continue to honor the alliance, but the English population exploded and they stopped acting like guests and started acting like rulers. They demanded obedience, but most importantly, they demanded indigenous land. Year by year, acre by acre, Wampanoag territory was siphoned off. This was often done through deed games, dishonest land dealings, and just outright coercion. By the time Massasoit died in 1661, the English had him surrounded. The alliance was not broken by indigenous violence, but colonial greed. And by 1676, during King Philip's War, Massasoit's son, Metacomet, would be killed, leading a resistance against English colonization. In less than 60 years, Wampanoag sovereignty would be completely dissolved. And Metacom, Massasoit's son, after he was killed, his head would be placed on a pike where it stood in front of Plymouth for 2 decades. If you want to learn more about King Philip's War and Metacom's resistance, check out episode 6. I discuss it in detail. Here's the unpleasant reality. Without the help of the Wampanoag and Massasoit's compassion and generosity, the Plymouth Colony would have never survived. Without the assistance from Tisquantum, the English would have never learned how to plant corn and where to find food in this new land. But in 1 generation, Wampanoag generosity was repaid with land theft and dispossession. So why do we cling to the first Thanksgiving story? Why is it so protected? Sociologically speaking, it serves as a type of civil religion, and it validates American exceptionalism. This belief that the United States is uniquely moral and divinely chosen. The myth functions like propaganda. It sanitizes invasion into settlement. It pushes the idea that this was nobody's land and that it was free for the taking. And it completely erases the settler violence required to build a nation. The modern day holiday that we know as Thanksgiving wasn't solidified until during the Civil War. The country needed a unifying story, a national memory that made America feel good about itself. Now let's circle back to 1970, Plymouth, Massachusetts. When Frank James was told to rewrite his speech, he refused. And out of that refusal came the National Day of Mourning. Every year, while millions eat turkey, Native people and allies gather at Plymouth, not to celebrate, but to remember. To remember the genocide, the land theft, and the resilience of those who survived. So here's the takeaway from this masterclass. Challenging the myth of Thanksgiving isn't about guilt. It's about historical literacy and refusing to inherit the lie. And rejecting this lie is a reminder that settler colonialism is not over. The structure that created the Thanksgiving myth still shapes policy, media, and education today. This is why it's important for us to decolonize our understanding of U.S. history, thus challenge the structure of settler colonialism. And when we do this decolonizing work, it not only benefits Indigenous nations, it benefits everyone. If you made it to the end, I appreciate you hanging in there with me. Also, if you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. I really do enjoy reading your feedback. To my Patreons, thank you so much for all your support. Couldn't do this work without you. If you have any recommendations for a future episode, feel free to reach out and let me know. All right, y'all, till next time.